They called it aid. They called it partnership. But beneath the polished speeches and smiling handshakes lies a darker truth, a web of invisible chains tightening around an entire continent. From glittering boardrooms in London and Washington to the dusty roads of rural Africa, decisions are made that determine who stays rich and who never escapes poverty. Billions flow in and out every year, yet the schools stay broken, the hospitals empty, and the people trapped. What if Africa's poverty isn't a tragedy of chance, but a system designed to keep it that way? Stay till the end, because what you'll discover will change how you see every headline about helping Africa forever. Africa, a land of breathtaking beauty, endless savannas, glittering minerals, and people of unstoppable spirit. Yet, beneath the surface of vibrant colors and ancient rhythm lies a quiet, invisible storm, one that has raged for centuries. The world calls Africa poor, but the truth is far more complex. It is not poverty of resources, but poverty of freedom. From the skies, Africa looks like abundance itself, golden deserts stretching into the horizon, rivers that shimmer like liquid silver, forests dense with life. Beneath the soil rests more than 30% of the world's mineral wealth. Gold, diamonds, cobalt, and oil, treasures that should have built empires for its people. Yet somehow it all slips away. Year after year, generation after generation. The story begins long before modern borders were drawn. When ships first arrived on its coasts centuries ago, they came with promises of trade, faith, and civilization. But what followed was conquest, extraction, and control. The chains of slavery were forged, and even after they were broken, new chains, invisible but stronger, were created. Chains of debt, dependency, and deceit. Fast forward to the present day. The world proudly calls itself globalized, a network of cooperation and progress. But beneath the polished speeches and handshakes at international summits lies a shadow economy, one that keeps Africa kneeling while others rise. The new rulers no longer wear crowns. They wear suits. Their weapons are not swords, but contracts, not guns, but loans, not armies, but institutions. Every year, trillions of dollars worth of natural wealth leave African soil. Cobalt mined in Congo powers the smartphones of the modern world. Diamonds from Sierra Leone sparkle in luxury stores. Oil from Nigeria fuels foreign cities, while power outages cripple its own. In classrooms, young Africans are taught about independence, how their countries freed themselves from colonial rule decades ago. But true independence never arrived. It was quietly rewritten in the fine print of international agreements, in the conditional loans from development banks, and in the quiet deals signed behind closed doors. To the world, it appears like aid. Humanitarian missions, relief funds, foreign investments, words that sound noble, even heroic. But aid often comes with strings attached, invisible strings that pull economies into directions that serve outsiders more than locals. Consider this. For every dollar Africa receives in aid, several dollars flow out through unfair trade deals, profit repatriation, and debt repayments. The numbers don't lie. Africa gives more to the world than it receives. But how did this cycle begin? And more importantly, who benefits from keeping it alive? In the 1960s, when most African nations gained political independence, a new era was supposed to dawn. Hope soared. Flags changed. Anthems filled the air. But as new leaders stepped into power, old empires found new ways to control. Instead of armies, they used economics. Instead of colonizers, they sent consultants. Institutions like the IMF and World Bank entered the scene, offering loans to developing nations. The promise sounded simple: financial support to rebuild economies, expand infrastructure, and create jobs. But hidden within those loans were conditions: structural adjustment programs that demanded African nations cut public spending, privatize resources and open markets to foreign corporations. Hospitals lost funding. Schools were starved. Farmers could no longer compete with subsidized imports. The same hands that offered money quietly took control of how it would be spent. And soon, the chains tightened again. Chains of debt this time, binding entire generations to a system they never agreed to. Africa's leaders stood at crossroads. Some resisted. They dreamed of unity, of building an Africa that stood tall and independent. But resistance came at a price. Those who challenged the system faced coups, sanctions, or mysterious accidents. Those who complied became wealthy while their people starved. A quiet understanding took root. To survive in politics, one must obey the global order. The few who spoke out were silenced, and the machine continued. And so the continent entered a new age, an age of apparent progress but internal decay. Shiny skyscrapers in capital cities masked crumbling schools in villages. Politicians posed with foreign investors for cameras, while farmers sold their land for pennies to multinational giants. The cycle became self-sustaining. Africa's resources were extracted cheaply, exported raw, and then imported back as expensive finished goods. The world applauded development, but it was development for someone else's benefit. Meanwhile, the people, the heart of Africa, continued to fight for survival. Women walked miles to fetch clean water. Children studied by candlelight. Entire families depended on remittances from relatives working abroad. Yet through all this, hope remained unbroken, because Africa has always been more than its struggles. Its people are inventors, artists, dreamers, young minds building apps, designing solar solutions, leading climate movements. The spirit refuses to die. Still, one question echoes louder every year. If Africa is so rich, why are Africans still poor? The answer lies not in the soil, but in the systems. Systems that were built not to free Africa, but to manage it. Systems dressed in the language of help, but rooted in control. From cocoa farms in Ghana to lithium mines in Zimbabwe, profit margins favor corporations thousands of miles away. Western companies and financial elites dictate the price of raw materials, the terms of loans, and even the economic policies of nations they don't govern. Every leader who dreams of breaking free must choose stability under control or chaos in freedom. Some countries tried the latter, seeking to reclaim ownership of their resources, to rewrite the rules. But each time, they were punished by economic isolation, market collapse, or internal conflict fueled by foreign interests. By the early 2000s, the pattern had become clear. While the media praised aid to Africa, the continent was losing far more than it gained. Capital flight, tax evasion, and unfair trade drained hundreds of billions annually. The aid narrative became a mask, a moral cover for a global system of exploitation. Even today, the story repeats. Partnerships for progress are announced at international forums, but the same unequal dynamics persist. Massive corporations continue to dominate African markets, dictating prices, controlling industries, and shaping laws that protect their profits. And for ordinary Africans, hope turns into frustration. They see their land enriched others while their own children struggle to eat. They hear promises of shared prosperity, but live in realities of endless struggle. Behind every statistic lies a human face, a miner in Congo who risks his life for a few dollars, so the world can have electric cars. A mother in Nigeria watching oil wealth enrich foreign shareholders while her town suffers oil spills. A farmer in Kenya crushed by imported goods labeled as foreign aid. Each of them, unknowingly, is bound by the same invisible chain, a system that feeds off their labor and resources while pretending to help. But history teaches one thing. Chains, no matter how strong, eventually break. And across the continent, whispers of change are rising. A new generation refuses to inherit the same fate. They question the narratives, challenge the contracts, and expose the hypocrisy of the global order. For centuries, Africa was told it needed saving. But now, a silent rebellion grows. A rebellion not of guns, but of minds. This is where our story truly begins, at the crossroads of past and future, where the people of Africa are beginning to uncover the truth behind the smiling faces and polished speeches. The truth that poverty was never an accident. It was engineered, and once you see the chains, you can never unsee them. The deeper one looks, the clearer it becomes. The world does not simply ignore Africa's struggles. It profits from them. Each system that claims to help has a hidden side, a shadow that feeds on dependency. The face of control has changed, but the structure remains the same. In conference halls of Europe, Policymakers discuss Africa's development challenges. They speak in polished tones about economic reforms, stability, and growth targets. But these decisions, drafted in languages many Africans never speak, dictate how African economies must function. Behind every policy paper, a quiet truth whispers, control the rules, and you control the game. The debt web decades ago. When African nations accepted loans from global institutions, they believed they were buying progress. Roads, power plants, schools, the dream of modernization seemed within reach. But with each signature, the debt web grew tighter. Today, some African nations spend more on interest payments than on healthcare or education. The more they pay, the deeper they fall, because the system isn't designed to end debt. It's designed to sustain it. When a nation struggles to pay, it borrows more. And in return for help, lenders demand control over budgets, taxes, and spending priorities. A finance minister in a struggling country may stand before his people and announce austerity measures, cutting subsidies, freezing wages, privatizing state assets. The people feel the pain, but few realize those decisions are not truly his. They are dictated from thousands of miles away. Hospitals close, schools crumble, but payments to creditors never stop. And when foreign companies step in to rescue these industries, they buy them cheap. State-owned assets, railways, ports, mines, sold off to private investors who promise efficiency but deliver exploitation. The profits fly out of Africa. The debts remain. A cruel irony forms. The continent richest in resources becomes the continent most indebted. The trade trap debt isn't the only chain. Trade, the supposed engine of growth, is another silent weapon. African countries export raw materials, cocoa, copper, oil, tea, coffee. They import finished goods made from those same materials at 10 times the price. A single bar of chocolate might earn a cocoa farmer in Ghana a few cents, while a European company earns millions from the same beans. The trade system is rigged, locking Africa into the role of supplier, never manufacturer. And when African nations attempt to process their own raw materials to move up the value chain, the world economy pushes back. Tariffs rise, sanctions appear, trade deals are quietly rewritten. The message is clear: stay where you are. Even within free trade agreements, the power lies with the wealthy. African nations are told to open their markets, but rich countries protect theirs. Subsidized European and American products flood African shelves, undercutting local farmers and manufacturers. A Kenyan dairy farmer cannot compete with imported milk powder that sells for less than what it costs him to feed his cows. A textile worker in Ethiopia loses her job when second-hand clothes from abroad fill the markets. Dependency deepens. Self-sufficiency fades. The illusion of choice hides the reality of control. The corporate empire beneath the banners of globalization. A new kind of empire rises, one built not on territory, but on ownership. Multinational corporations dominate African industries from mining to agriculture. They control production, pricing, and export routes. For them, Africa is not a partner. It is a resource field. Take cobalt, the blue metal that powers electric cars and smartphones. Over 70% of the world's supply comes from Congo, yet the wealth it generates almost never stays there. Giant corporations extract the mineral, export it for refinement abroad, and leave behind devastated land and exploited workers. In the shadows, children dig with bare hands in toxic pits, earning pennies to sustain global progress. Western consumers see green technology. Africans see poisoned rivers and collapsing mines. Oil tells a similar story. Nigeria, one of the world's largest oil producers, imports most of its refined fuel. Foreign companies extract its crude, ship it away, refine it overseas, and sell it back at inflated prices. Each drop of oil feeds a global profit chain that ends far from African shores. Corporations pay minimal taxes, moving profits through offshore accounts. Governments that depend on their investment dare not challenge them. A silent agreement prevails. Let us extract, and we will fund your campaigns, build your towers, and keep you in power. And so, leaders become gatekeepers, protecting foreign interests while their own people starve. The political game no system of control survives without cooperation from within. The global order rewards obedience. Politicians who align with Western or corporate agendas are praised as progressive reformers. Those who resist are branded corrupt, radical, or unstable. And if a leader dares to nationalize resources or reject foreign control, history has shown what follows. Sudden coups, civil unrest, assassinations hidden behind political excuses. In the shadows, intelligence agencies, corporations, and financial institutions work in unison, reshaping governments that dare to step out of line. The people never see the puppeteers, only the chaos they leave behind. Meanwhile, billions in African money rest in Western banks. Corrupt elites, empowered by foreign connections, stash away the wealth that should build schools and hospitals. The same countries that condemn corruption profit from it. It is a perfect circle of hypocrisy, where thieves are praised as strategic partners and patriots are punished as threats to democracy. The media illusion every chain needs a disguise, and that disguise is narrative. Global media plays its part, crafting stories that shape perception. Africa is often portrayed as helpless, violent, diseased, and dependent. The message is subtle but consistent. Africa cannot save itself. It must be saved. This narrative justifies the system. It makes exploitation look like charity. It convinces the world that Africa's poverty is its own fault. Corruption, laziness, mismanagement, while ignoring the structures that sustain it. Foreign aid organizations use heartbreaking images of starving children to raise billions. Yet little of that money ever reaches those in need. Instead, it funds administrative costs, foreign consultants, and public relations campaigns. The cycle of pity becomes profitable. The image of Africa as the poor continent becomes one of the world's most valuable brands because it keeps donations flowing and systems unquestioned. The resource curse, perhaps the most tragic irony of all, is that wealth itself becomes a curse. Nations blessed with abundance often suffer the most. Oil in Angola, gold in Mali, diamonds in Sierra Leone. These riches should bring prosperity. Instead, they attract predators. Foreign interests fuel internal divisions, turning ethnic or political rivalries into wars over control. The profits of conflict flow outward, while the destruction remains behind. For every barrel of oil, a drop of blood. For every carat of diamond, a village displaced. Ordinary people bear the cost. Refugees, orphans, shattered families. They see the mines shining with promise, yet know that promise belongs to someone else. The silent revolution, and yet, beneath all this, something stirs. The youth of Africa are no longer silent. They see the hypocrisy. They read the fine print. They connect online, share stories, build movements. Digital platforms expose corruption, challenge global narratives, and create new alliances that bypass traditional power. Entrepreneurs are reclaiming ownership, building African-led startups that keep value on the continent. Farmers are forming cooperatives, refusing unfair prices. Activists demand transparency from leaders and corporations alike. It is not an armed rebellion, but an awakening, a quiet defiance spreading through cities and villages alike. The realization grows: Africa does not need saving. It needs sovereignty, and those who built the chains begin to feel the tremor. Because once the truth spreads, control begins to crumble. But powerful systems never collapse without a fight. The more Africa rises, the more resistance it faces. Economic warfare shifts forms through currency manipulation, disinformation, and diplomatic pressure. What happens next will decide the continent's future. As we approach the turning point of this story, one truth becomes undeniable. Africa's poverty is not the absence of potential. It is the presence of exploitation. And soon, the world will witness what happens when the chained decide to break free. The world wasn't ready when Africa began to rise, not with weapons, but with truth. It began quietly, like a whisper in the wind. A few leaders stood before the cameras and spoke words no one expected to hear. We will not pay these debts. At first, the world laughed. Economists called it suicide. Analysts said the markets would collapse. But the words spread faster than anyone could contain them. Across cities and villages, across languages and borders, Africans began to question, why should we keep paying for our own chains? What followed was not chaos, but awakening. In Ghana, protests filled the streets, not in anger, but in unity. Young men and women, carrying signs that read, "Africa is not poor," marched peacefully to Parliament. In Nigeria, students organized mass boycotts, demanding full transparency on oil revenues. In Kenya, farmers dumped imported grain in the streets, declaring they would no longer accept prices dictated by foreign hands. For decades, the people had been told that power was elsewhere, in Washington, in London, in Geneva. But now, they realized that the greatest power of all had always been their collective refusal to submit. The old system trembled. International institutions issued warnings. Ratings agencies downgraded African economies. Foreign investors pulled out, threatening disaster. News anchors around the world spoke in alarmed tones, painting the continent as unstable, reckless, dangerous. But behind the panic, a new narrative took shape, one not written by outsiders, but by Africans themselves. A summit was held in Addis Ababa, not one of empty speeches, but of quiet resolve. Presidents, economists, and youth leaders gathered, not to beg for aid, but to plan independence in its truest form. They spoke of a shared currency built by Africans for Africans, of trade routes that connected their nations directly, bypassing colonial ports, of technology hubs and energy grids powered by the sun and owned by the people. For the first time in history, the idea of economic freedom didn't sound like a dream. It sounded like a plan. But the moment Africa began to pull the chains, the system that built them pulled back harder. Foreign governments froze aid packages. Loans were withheld. Sanctions whispered in diplomatic corridors. News stories of political instability began flooding screens. The message was clear: obey or be isolated. In one nation, when the government refused to sell off its copper mines to foreign investors, the stock market crashed overnight. Engineered panic. In another, when a president announced the creation of a sovereign digital currency, his administration faced a sudden wave of protests, fueled by online disinformation campaigns traced to foreign networks. It was not coincidence. It was a warning, but this time, Africa did not bow. Ordinary people who once waited for change from leaders began building it themselves. In Senegal, young engineers built local solar farms when foreign energy firms withdrew. In Rwanda, coders designed digital wallets that allowed farmers to sell crops without middlemen. In South Africa, activists launched open databases exposing corporate tax evasion. Every hidden transaction, every siphoned profit, laid bare for the world to see. The truth was out, and it could not be undone. At the United Nations, African representatives stood together, not as fragmented voices, but as one. A single statement echoed across the chamber. Africa will no longer be a source of wealth for others while our children go hungry. Silence followed. Cameras flashed, analysts whispered. For a brief electric moment, the balance of power shifted. And then, the backlash. Currency wars erupted. Trade deals were suspended. Media headlines screamed of economic disaster. But something extraordinary happened. Africa did not collapse. Because while the world tried to isolate it, Africans began to turn inward, trading with one another, supporting local industries, and creating regional supply chains. What once was called the weakest link became a network of resilience. Still, the battle was far from over. In the digital age, wars are fought with information. False reports of famine, coups, and corruption flooded international media. Foreign think tanks predicted the inevitable failure of African independence. Investors fled, only to return quietly through back doors under new names. But even in the storm, the fire of defiance burned bright. In one symbolic act that shook the world, a coalition of African nations announced they would no longer export raw materials without value addition at home. Gold, cobalt, cocoa, everything would be processed, refined, and branded in Africa. Factories began to rise where mines once stood. Youth employment soared, local currencies strengthened, and when the first chocolate bar stamped with "Made in Ghana" reached international markets, It sold out in hours, not because it was exotic, but because it was empowering. Across the continent, a quiet pride returned, not of nationalism but of dignity. For centuries, Africa's wealth had been stolen in silence. Now the world was forced to listen, but the climax of this awakening wasn't in parliaments or boardrooms. It was in the hearts of the people. A young woman in Malawi started a social enterprise, using recycled waste to build affordable homes. A group of farmers in Uganda developed their own digital trading platform, free from middlemen. In the slums of Nairobi, children learned coding on shared devices, dreaming not of escaping their country but transforming it. This was the revolution, not violent, but visionary. The global order that once saw Africa as a passive participant now faced a continent that demanded equality. Every threat, every sanction, every attempt to destabilize only exposed the truth further. As the pressure grew, world leaders were forced to respond. Summits were called. Cameras flashed again. But this time, Africa was not begging for inclusion. It was setting terms. In one defining moment, an African president stood before a crowded global forum. The world watched as he held up two contracts, one from a Western lender, another from a regional African investment bank. The first, he said, offers billions with conditions. The second offers less money but full sovereignty. We choose sovereignty. The room fell silent. That silence became a symbol, the sound of centuries of submission breaking. And though the world's financial powers tightened their grip in panic, they could not undo what had begun, because this was no longer just about money. It was about identity. The realization spread beyond Africa's borders, to Latin America, to Asia, to every region that had ever been called developing. The lie was unraveling. The truth was simple, undeniable, and dangerous to those in power. Africa was never poor. It was made poor. And now, it was undoing that design, thread by thread. But the greatest battles were yet to come, not against armies, but against ideas. Centuries of conditioning could not be erased in one generation. The fight ahead would demand courage, unity, and vision. Still, for the first time in modern history, Africa was not reacting to the world. The world was reacting to Africa, and from the dust of exploitation rose something unstoppable. The will to be free. The chains that once bound the continent were cracking. Each act of defiance was a hammer strike, each voice of truth a spark. As dawn broke over the continent, from Cairo to Cape Town, from Lagos to Nairobi, the world witnessed a new kind of revolution. Not one that sought revenge, but restoration. And in that moment, one truth became undeniable. The empire built on Africa's silence was beginning to fall apart. When the dust began to settle, the world looked at Africa, not with pity, but with awe. What many predicted would end in disaster instead became the spark of a global awakening. For the first time in modern history, a continent long seen as a pawn had flipped the board. It did not happen overnight. The early years were hard. There were shortages, market shocks, and painful transitions. Nations that had depended for decades on foreign aid had to rebuild their foundations from the ground up. But through the struggle, something extraordinary took shape. A self-sustaining system, rooted in unity, innovation, and pride. The same youth who once dreamed of leaving their countries began dreaming of rebuilding them. African engineers returned from abroad to lead infrastructure projects. Economists who once worked for foreign banks began designing new, homegrown financial institutions, and slowly, the chains that had bound the continent, debt, dependency, and doubt, began to dissolve. The rebirth of ownership in the heart of Congo. Once exploited for its cobalt, new industries rose. African-owned factories refined minerals locally, creating thousands of jobs and tripling export revenue. The wealth that once vanished into offshore accounts now circulated through local economies, building schools, hospitals, and innovation hubs. In Ghana, a value revolution took hold. Farmers who once sold raw cocoa beans to foreign companies became co-owners of regional cooperatives. They didn't just farm, they branded, processed, and exported their own chocolate under proudly African labels. Every bar that reached international markets told a story, not of charity, but of triumph. Consumers around the world began to notice. Made in Africa was no longer a rarity. It was a badge of quality and conscience. In Kenya and Rwanda, tech startups flourished. Local coders created apps for agriculture, energy and education, connecting farmers to buyers, children to virtual classrooms, and entrepreneurs to global investors. What was once called the digital divide began to close, one invention at a time. The world had underestimated Africa's greatest resource, its people. The fall of the old system as African economies strengthened, the balance of power shifted. The institutions that once dictated terms, the IMF, the World Bank, global trade bodies, were forced to renegotiate. The rules could no longer ignore a united continent representing over 1 billion people and vast untapped markets. The Western media's tone changed too. Where they once spoke of poverty and instability, they now spoke of African innovation and the new global frontier. But the transformation wasn't just economic, it was psychological. For centuries, Africa had been defined by narratives of lack. Now, it defined itself by abundance. Debt forgiveness campaigns became irrelevant because Africa had already rewritten the rules, creating its own banks, its own currencies, its own trade alliances. The African Monetary Union, once a distant dream, became reality. A shared digital currency, backed by gold and rare minerals, broke dependency on external systems. Global markets tried to resist, but the tide was unstoppable. Investors realized that partnership, not control, was the only path forward, and so, one by one, the pillars of the old order crumbled, not through violence, but through obsolescence. The new generation of leaders, the new Africa, did not rise on slogans, but on vision. Gone were the leaders who ruled for foreign applause or personal gain. In their place stood a generation of reformers, young, educated, and unbought. They spoke not in the language of aid, but in the language of equity. They understood that the world's respect is not given. It is earned through self-respect. Policies changed. Education systems shifted focus from rote learning to creativity, entrepreneurship, and ethics. Environmental sustainability became a cornerstone of growth. Africa refused to repeat the mistakes of the industrialized world, and with every reform, the people grew more united, across borders, languages, and faiths. The African Union evolved into a genuine federation, with shared defense, infrastructure, and economic planning. For the first time, the idea of united Africa was not just a dream whispered by visionaries, it was a living reality. The rise of Africa shook the world economy. As the continent began producing its own refined products, global corporations lost their monopoly. Countries in Latin America and Southeast Asia followed suit, inspired by Africa's defiance. A wave of global South solidarity swept across nations that had once been labeled developing. They too began to demand fair trade, local ownership, and sovereignty. The power centers of the old world, Wall Street, London, Paris, found themselves negotiating, not dictating. But not everyone rejoiced. Some feared losing their dominance. Disinformation campaigns tried to stir division, painting the new order as chaos. Yet the truth was undeniable. The world was simply becoming balanced. For centuries, a few had controlled the many. Now, the many were standing tall. The African model became a blueprint for independence, showing that true power lies not in following the global order, but in rewriting it, healing from the past. But freedom is not only about economics, it's also about healing. Across Africa, museums and memorials began to rise, not to glorify pain, but to remember it. Children learned history not from colonial textbooks, but from stories of resilience. The slave trade, colonization, and exploitation were taught not as shame, but as lessons, reminders of what must never happen. Again, reparations once demanded from the world became irrelevant. When Africa repaired itself from within, communities rebuilt the connection between progress and culture. Blending modern technology with ancestral wisdom, cities once built for colonial profit were redesigned for community and sustainability. Solar grids lit up villages that had waited generations for electricity. Clean water flowed where promises once dried up. The sound of construction replaced the silence of neglect. But above all, the greatest change was invisible: the rise of dignity. For centuries, Africa had been spoken about. Now it was speaking for itself. The world reacts at first. Some global powers resisted. Trade wars, political pressure, and propaganda tried to fracture the unity. But unity held firm. Africa had something it never had before: leverage. It controlled the minerals essential for modern technology, from lithium to cobalt to rare earth elements. And this time, it negotiated from strength. Instead of selling raw resources cheaply, it demanded technology transfers, joint ventures, and local employment guarantees. Foreign companies had to play by Africa's rules or leave empty-handed. A new kind of diplomacy emerged, one based on respect, not charity. Countries that once ignored Africa now sought its partnership. Conferences once held in Geneva or New York now took place in Nairobi and Accra. The world's economic future no longer belonged to one hemisphere. The spiritual awakening with freedom came. Reflection. Religious leaders, artists, and philosophers began to explore what true liberation meant. Not just politically or economically, but spiritually. They asked, what does it mean to be free if we think like the oppressed? From this question, a new cultural renaissance was born. Music, film, and literature exploded across the continent. African stories told by African voices began to dominate global screens. The world saw Africa not as an experiment, but as an inspiration. This was not just a revolution of systems. It was a restoration of identity. The legacy years later, historians would mark this era not as a time of rebellion, but of rebirth, the moment when a continent broke its silence, saw its reflection, and chose to rise. Economists wrote books about the African century. Environmentalists hailed the continent's green policies as a model for sustainable growth. Even former critics admitted, the world was better when Africa was free. And while the old powers struggled to adjust, Africa flourished. Its population, once called a burden, became its strength. Its diversity, once seen as division, became its unity. Its scars, once hidden, became symbols of survival. The story that began in pain ended in power. And through it all, one truth echoed louder than ever: Africa was never poor. It was robbed, but now it had reclaimed everything that mattered. Final scene, a cinematic closing. The sun rises over the Serengeti, casting golden light across endless plains. Children laugh as solar drones hum overhead, delivering books and medicine. Farmers harvest fields nourished by sustainable irrigation systems. In cities, skyscrapers shaped like traditional masks gleam under the morning sky. A montage unfolds, faces of engineers, teachers, artists, elders. Each one different, yet united by the same quiet fire: pride. A voice narrates softly. For centuries they said Africa was behind. But what they called behind was preparation. What they called poverty was patience. And what they called chains were lessons, melted, reshaped, and forged into strength. As the camera pans out over the continent, lights shimmer like constellations across the night, each one a story, a dream, a future. The world once came to Africa to take. Now it comes to learn, and with that final line the screen fades to black, replaced by one simple message. Africa was never the problem. It was the answer.